Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Pope Metallicus, and welcome to another episode of Rock and Roll Religion, where we're covering, the early part of actual heavy metal at this point. Up till now, we've been going through the history of rock and roll, and that wasn't enough of the story for me. I want to go all the way through it. So we're over the next few months, we'll probably, cover it in about 5-6 year chunks, really the major movements of heavy metal and probably punk, because I'm also into that kind of stuff and it kind of tracks right along with it. So with that being all being said, welcome to it. Just brief showing. I do have a Stream Elements link down in the description if you do feel like supporting me directly. I do like these longer topics. I really actually do love doing so. I really appreciate any support you guys give me, and that'll just encourage me to keep doing more of this. So if you like it, great. And I'd appreciate you guys sharing the link, sharing the stream out and all that, because that all helps towards, getting us out there and getting more people listening to this kind of stuff, because this is really the genesis of actual heavy building up to it. So we started off, or we left off last time in about 1969, 1970 with kind of the psychedelic rock movement, guys like, Jimi Hendrix, Carlos Santana, Iron Butterfly, who will, dovetail right heavily into this one. The sounds of metal were pretty much there. Even in 69, you had bands like MC5, who we'll get to in a bit, that were around, more proto-punk or hard rock than what would typify early metal, but they're right along there with it. And, at this point, there was no quote-unquote definition for heavy metal. There still kind of isn't. It's kind of one of those things, it when you hear it. And speaking of knowing it when we heard it, we'll get right into the first band I want to talk about, and this is the first heavy metal album ever recorded. Pretty much, according to everyone, this is where it starts. This is the moment where heavy metal was born in sound, if not in name, quite yet. And we have, obviously, Black Sabbath by Black Sabbath, one of the first guitar riffs I ever learned to play, by the way, because it's fairly simple. And really just an absolute monster of a record. I mean, you have a lot of their classic stuff on here. NIB's off this record. The Wizard, which I believe is the first original song they ever wrote and had been playing since like 1968. So that's pretty cool. And then, of course, the self-titled Black Sabbath, one of the darkest and doomiest songs I've ever heard, and pretty much single-handedly spawned doom metal in and of itself. And this was a very dark, very kind of interestingly paced album, because you had a lot of stuff that still sounded like a lot of blues and jazz type stuff. You still had a lot of that blues influence, and it was a lot slower. But due to Tony Iommi's hand injury, he had amputated the tips of two of his fingers. And so he had to put little prosthetics on the end of his fingers so he could still bend the guitar string properly, but he couldn't feel it. So he had to detune his guitars a little bit to lessen the tension on the string so he could properly bend. And that created this very deep, very dark sound to all of that music that was absolutely kick-ass. And at the time, everyone was terrified of it, except the people who were really into something new and were really out to hear something very different from what everybody else was into. And this certainly delivered that. This is, early 1970, and not content with, establishing a genre in one go, they released a second album in 1970, unfortunately on the day Jimi Hendrix died. And that would be possibly their best, actually definitely their best known album, and one of their best outright in Paranoid. I mean, pretty much dig down the entire track listening to this thing. They're all fucking awesome. You have, obviously the title track, which was actually a throw in at the last minute. Like they didn't mean to put it on the record. And they just kind of threw it in there because they needed another track. And lo and behold, it was Paranoid that became an instant icon and still one of their classics and stayed in their repertoire their entire career. Wish I could say they're still playing it today, but unfortunately they hung it up in about 2015. So unfortunately we won't be seeing them live again, which at this point, I mean, the original lineup, Ozzy's pretty much had it. I don't think he can really even tour anymore. He's canceled the last like 4 tours he's supposed to have been on, and I think this is going to be it. So this album, like whether it's Paranoid, War Pigs, Fairies Wear Boots, Hand of Doom, Iron Man, freaking everything on this record is absolutely stellar. And this is, I think, where people really grabbed hold of it. Like Black Sabbath was a seismic shift in music to the real music nerds out there. This is when people started hearing them. And everyone just kind of stood in shock at what was coming out. The music critics all hated it, which, follows the meme of music critics hate it, must be good. They've never really been on point with it. Although I will give music journalism some credit. They actually came up with the name heavy metal in about 72 after the lyric in Steppenwolf's Born to Be Wild in 68, which, is kind of a proto-metal sound in and of itself. But these guys had that dark, oppressive sound that was perfect for talking about some really kind of darker subjects and really kind of angrier music, because what we're used to in the 60s is a lot of very either way out there, drugged out heavy metal, or not heavy metal, but psychedelic rock, or, the kind of flowery, folksy hippie music of, the Vietnam era. And that was kind of this was kind of a reaction to that of, this is what all the college kids think. These are all in the case of Black Sabbath, I think 3 of them worked in a steel mill. And then surprisingly enough, Geezer Butler was an accountant who dabbled in witchcraft. So, there you go. And this is where people kind of got really scared about metal really fast. And it was kind of a misunderstanding from the start, where Sabbath always kind of used occult themes and darker imagery for their music, but it wasn't openly satanic. Well, yet anyway. We're going to get into that. And, they immediately caught flack from the Christians and stuff like that. And they had some very thought-provoking lyrics in this and later albums about, I always bring up the song After Forever, where they had the line, "Would you like to see the Pope on the end of a rope? Do you think he's a fool?" That was not a career-enhancing statement in 1971. People were absolutely, utterly in shock of these guys on the outside. And then all the bands loved them and wanted to be just like him. And, this started this whole musical avalanche. And, we'll get into it in a minute. We have, not even that much later. I think this is 74. You have my personal favorite Sabbath album, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, where you can start to see some of the satanic imagery creep in. It's not openly satanic. It's just kind of supposed to be dark and creepy. And yeah, Christian, some of the greatest classics are flukes. Like, you never know what people are going to resonate with. And sometimes you just throw a song on a record, you don't even think it's that good. And lo and behold, everyone loves it. But you get into this period where a lot of album covers, like we'll get to, are either using a lot of very fantasy themed imagery, or very kind of dark and creepy imagery, not outright demonic, but very occult, essentially. We'll use that for lack of a better term. You guys will see what I mean towards the end of the video. Um, but this was really the high point for me for Black Sabbath. I mean, you have the title track, which is one of the greatest fucking songs I've ever heard. Just absolutely titanic riffage. Tony Iommi is absolutely the master songwriter when it comes to just catchy riffs that are also dark and evil. I love it. And it's fitting that we're talking about these guys right about this time of year. We're going into Halloween season. And so, we're getting a little more on the dark and creepy side of the house, which is fine. I absolutely adore some of those bands. It's one of those things that, if done well, can be an absolute showstopper. And as we'll get to in a minute with another artist, that while not specifically metal, he definitely added a lot to the scene in terms of the ethos and the imagery and stuff like that. Because metal started out as just, the music, but it adopted this life of its own later that was absolutely like, no one ever thought it would get to. But, there were other bands around at this period kind of doing the same thing. I'll point to a couple here real quick. I mean, up next, we have Uriah Heep, who was another one that's been around since way back when. I've actually seen these guys live a couple years ago opening for Judas Priest, and they're still fucking awesome. This one is Demons and Wizards from 1972. I don't believe this was their first album. This is by far their biggest, though. This had their one major hit in Easy Living. But it's a pretty interesting thing. They're kind of more deep purplish than they are Black Sabbath, but they did have that very heavy rhythm section and stuff like that. That kind of lends itself very well to this style of music. And I think they brought a lot into the scene too, like the synthesizer. For those of you in the back haven't been paying attention all along, yes, synthesizers are metal. They always have been and always will be. Shut up about it. It's one of those instruments that it can be used really badly and sound really overproduced and bullshit. But when it's done right, it can be absolutely outstanding. We got a tip from an anonymous donor saying 669 is better than 666. Well, you gotta flip it. You gotta flip one every now and again just to have fun with it. Besides, it's very nice. So thank you for that. You have Magician's Birthday in your vault. That's awesome. That's a great one to pick up on. And these guys, they were never super popular in the scene. Like everybody who's really into this side of rock knows them, but they're one of those bands that kind of skated under the radar for a lot of years. So definitely recommend, talking about these guys and picking up some of their records because they have some hits. And like I said, they're still excellent today. And I believe it's mostly their original lineup too. So, go check these guys out. Their name is Uriah Heep. They're fantastic. And right about the same time, we have a much more well-known band that was using Hammond organ / synthesizer at the same time. And MC5, like I said, they were around at this point. They were more on the punk rock side. They definitely did influence a lot of the more aggressive metal that came later. They have a couple of pretty good ones. This is a later compilation album. I just like the album art. I think it's cool. But they were definitely very proto-punk in their style, their presentation, and their political leanings, unfortunately. They had some associations with, let's just say, some very interesting people like the Black Panthers. So their career wasn't super, super long. They're around still, but their period of real relevance was from like 68 to 72 want to say. So right about in the same time we're talking, and these guys will be brought up again on a later date when we start going into punk, which will be either the next episode or the one after, I think, because towards the end of this segment, about 75, 76, you start to see that evolving. But getting back to the more the more melodic side of the house, we have these guys right here. You knew they were coming up at some point. They are widely credited as proto metal and straight up metal themselves. I think they kind of lie on the borderline, especially because you would have two of the members of this band, especially this lineup, being Ian Gillan and Richie Blackmore, go on to make their own marks in metal. Ian Gillan is part of Black Sabbath and a whole bunch of other bands, and Richie Blackmore as the guitarist for Rainbow, who we'll get to again later. So these guys, and this album specifically from 1972, I mean, you have some real bangers on this record. I mean, you start off the record with Highway Star, which that was real hardcore shit. Like, especially for the time, like no one had heard a song that's fast, really that fast paced. It was really just more of a straight ahead, almost speed metal track in a lot of ways before speed metal would become a thing. So it was very hard rock, very fast paced, excellent overall. And then, of course, we have, immortal classics like Space Truckin', which is just a fucking fun song. I really dig it. And of course, the first guitar riff everyone learns, and also the story of how this album came to be, being Smoke on the Water, probably the most recognized song off this record. And yeah, Lazy is a perfect Hammond organ demo for just how heavy they can be in the mix and really add that depth and crunch to the sound. That's an excellent choice. But this record is pretty much proof positive that, you know what, this is metal. This is Deep Purple firing on all cylinders as well. Probably the best the best albums they've ever done. I would put, songs like Perfect Strangers and stuff like that up against it, but that came later. So this is a very good early album from them. And these guys aren't the only ones. Other mainstream bands were starting to kind of move in this direction. You had Led Zeppelin 4 in 71 that had a lot of very hardcore elements on it. You had songs like the Immigrant Song and all this kind of stuff from Zeppelin in this period that were Communication Breakdown, Rock and Roll. They were more towards this line than they were to mainstream rock at this period. And I thought that was really cool that, you can, in a year or two, you can start to see that the real music scene was starting to shift in this hard rock direction that had been building for a while, but in 70, 71, it all came to a head and everyone started running down this path as fast as they could. And not just because it was super popular and was selling at the time, it was because it sounded good. Because these albums didn't sell. I mean, this album sold extremely well, but a lot of Black Sabbath's early stuff didn't do all that well commercially. Really until probably Paranoid or Snowblind. No, sorry, not Snowblind, Master of Reality. Snowblind is on that record, but it's not. Actually, no, it's not even on that record. Never mind, I'm retarded. But no, really up until this point in 72, 73, Sabbath themselves weren't really doing all that well. And in terms of sales, live, they were absolutely killing it. They were playing some huge shows and festivals, and everybody who heard it absolutely adored it, but not that many people were hearing it. So, it's one of those, the people who like it really like it. The people who don't really hate it. But it turned into this underground kind of thing, more like the extreme metal genres would in the 80s and 90s, where, there's your mainstream metalheads who go for bands like Poison well, not sorry, did not mean Poison, but like, Rat, Motley Crue, a lot of the more mainstream friendly bands. And then you had guys who were into Hellhammer, Slayer, as we covered on Sunday, Testament, real, underground bands at that time that wouldn't really kind of climb into the mainstream until the mid 80s. But we'll get there eventually. Don't you worry. That'll be a much later show because we've got about 3 generations to go till we get there. But, keep it on down the list. I mean, Deep Purple, super huge influence early on and really one of the exemplars of what it can be to the mainstream. I would consider this specifically a heavy metal record. They have ones that aren't, and I would hesitate to class them as a metal band. But yeah, Christian, you could easily change this into Metalhead because in '72, this was about as heavy as it got. So they were kind of pushing boundaries with this one. And then you have this guy. This one man has done more to change, especially the look and stage presence of metal as a genre than pretty much everyone else. Up until then, they were basically just a band on the stage, just playing, and there's nothing wrong with that. A lot of bands do that, and it's great. But this guy was putting on a stage show, and as he puts it, everybody had these rock and roll heroes and stuff like that. He wanted to be the villain. He wanted to be Snidely Whiplash. He wanted to be the guy that everyone loved to hate. And just put on, he had got the elaborate makeup and the longer hair and, the cooler outfits and all the leather, and especially his stage show. Holy shit. For 73, this man was putting, the funny part is his music isn't all that heavy. I mean, you have songs like No More Mr. Nice Guy and School's Out that are pretty good, but nowhere near the heavier or harder end of the spectrum. And then you have the stage show where, they execute him on stage every night. There's all sorts of horror themes and stuff like that. And man, it was just a seismic shift in the way metal bands did business, where they realized that it's not just about the music. The whole thing is part of the presentation. I mean, you're a circus. I mean, especially for a genre like heavy metal in the 70s, you're the sideshow. You are the circus rolls into town and everyone wants to come and see the weird shit. So like he channeled into that, and that's been a staple of the genre ever since, from the costumes to the makeup to the really crazy stage sets. There's a reason Blackie Lawless from Wasp looks a lot like this man and behaved a lot like him on stage. And he still does to this day. He's still absolutely fantastic. And like I said, his music's great too. And let's face it, if you don't know who Alice Cooper is, fix that shit. He is one of the greatest rock and metal guys of all time. And yeah, Christian, we will be getting into them towards the end because they were around at this point. They started in 1970, but they were basically a club band at this point in their career. They wouldn't record an album until 74. It wouldn't record a good album until 76. But, that's neither here nor there. Yeah, Alice Cooper, absolutely a unbelievable influence on everything that came later, especially from the stage side, which to me, you can't separate the live show from metal. It is such a big part of this genre of music specifically that I don't think you can ever separate one from the other. It's part of the show. There are entire albums that are basically written to be played live. And, there's bands that do this kind of stage show with, the big production and all that. And Iron Maiden's famous for it. Fuck, Ghost is really famous for it. Everybody does it at this point. And, a lot of it is part of the show. and it's all part of the show, really. Like it's theater in a way that only an old school like vaudeville performer would understand. Um, and that was an attitude that he really brought into the scene. Like all the shit you would see in, This Is Spinal Tap and stuff like that. This man's responsible for it pretty much single handedly. And speaking of Judas Priest, we get to not that one. No, God, no, still no. Just different album cover that's much better. There we go. This is where Judas Priest really starts. I mean, these guys are credited with, their nickname is the Metal Gods. And, you will never find a bigger Judas Priest fanboy than this channel right here. I will simp over their music until the cows come home, and I will absolutely not apologize for it. And this is really where their sound started to develop, is Sad Wings of Destiny from 1976. Obviously, you saw their previous installment, Rock-a-Rolla, in 74. If you value your opinion of this band, skip that one. It's not that it's a bad album. It's just that it doesn't sound like Judas Priest in any way, shape, or form. Because it wasn't written for the current lineup at the time. Their singer had left right before they recorded Rock-a-Rolla. And Al Atkins has a very, very different voice than Rob Halford. And my God, this album is where those vocals came into this genre of music. I mean, you had Ozzy that was kind of like more of like a unsettled wail. And then you had, Ian Gillan, who can kind of do that weird scream he does. And they're both fantastic at what they do. And then Rob came out with songs like Victim of Changes and The Ripper right off of the front of this album. And everyone's jaw about hit the floor. Because it wasn't even just the absolute stupid range he can reach to with his voice. It was how powerful he was in that range and how long he could hold it up, too. I mean, listen to the end of Victim of Changes. That's not an overdub. That's not multiple takes. I've seen the man do it live when he's almost 70 years old. That's insane. And they also brought in this twin guitar sound that bands really hadn't done up until this point. They were mostly 3 and 4 piece bands. And then you see Judas Priest come in with that second guitar, and you see the complexity that they can start weaving into it with stuff like this. And you really start to get a handle on why that started to take off. And right about this time too, you also have another topic for another day, the rise of the NWO BHM movement, the new wave of British heavy metal. Not really releasing albums yet per se, but bands like Saxon, Motorhead, Iron Maiden, they were all forming right about this time. So these guys were super, super instrumental in their upbringing. And then multiple other bands from later have pointed to this as one of their inspirations. Dave Mustaine from Megadeth, I believe Kerry King from Slayer, have both pointed straight at this record, not even just Priest in general, but right at this one. And again, you start to see the art on these albums take on that kind of darker tone as the decade goes on. So we're really starting to see what would become the metal standard kind of start to, cool, if you, or coagulate at this point towards the mid 70s. And then it just takes off into the stratosphere from then on out. You have these guys, and then another band I did want to talk about in this period, an absolutely huge, huge influence, and Ritchie Blackmore's second appearance on this list with his next band, Rainbow. Rainbow is super important for a number of reasons. Thank you, Christian. When I talk Priest, I start to get very wordy and very, very verbose, and that means the same thing. But they're my favorite band, full stop. I will never shut up about them. And that's one of their true classics. And this is no different. I mean, Richie Blackmore, apparently not satisfied with creating one kick ass rock/metal band, went on and just made another one when he left Deep Purple to found Rainbow. And for those of you who are interested, I'm just going to talk about their early career here. I've actually already done a Rock and Roll Religion on Rainbow, so if you haven't seen that, go check it out. On this era of Rainbow specifically, and here is a very important moment in metal history, because again, we see the entrance of one of the true gods of this genre of music. A guy who had been in music since 1958 or 9, but really hadn't come into this side of the house until then. And a man who would go on to redefine what it means to not only be a metal singer, but a metalhead in general, Ronnie James Dio behind the mic. And this is one of those, again, a lot of synthesizer, a lot of Hammond organ and stuff like that, because that's all Richie's stuff. But they would really start this sound that would go on to be better known as power metal later. And you can see it right in the artwork. They have, the very fantasy-esque combined with the rock imagery. And it's really, these guys were a real pioneer in that side of bringing the real fantasy elements into heavy metal. And that's something, again, that would continue to this day. It would spin off into its own subgenre later. And a band that I wouldn't strictly consider metal, but another one that did stuff like this earlier in their career is Queen. And don't you worry, we're going to get to them at some point, because I loves me some Queen. And this is one of those seminal moments where everybody can just point to and go, that's metal. Like, everybody will argue whether, like, this Led Zeppelin song or, is AC/DC metal or whatever. And, you can see multiple opinions on it. Either way, this ain't one of those. This is one of those things. Yes, that's fucking metal. Everyone knows it. This is a true, guidepost on the path to enlightenment, shall we say. It wasn't just bands that were getting established during this time, bands that would go on to be famous outside of this genre too. Bands that made it into the mainstream started being influenced by this, especially on their early stuff. You can hear it. Again, I've already done a Rock and Roll Religion on the next band that we're going to talk about, but no one will be surprised. Canada's own Rush. This first record absolutely crushes. Like, they were basically the Canadian Black Sabbath at this point. Like, they were using super heavy riffs. They were still a 3-piece band, which they always have been. And goddamn, I love these guys for that. Their early stuff is very heavy, almost more power metal in some instances, mainly on later stuff, because they went with a very fantasy and sci-fi themed band. But I did want to mention them here because these guys start out in 75 and they were very, very heavy metal influenced. And, it shows that metal wasn't just influencing itself at this point and kind of iterating. It was also influencing everything around it. By this point in 75, you had, Led Zeppelin coming out with some pretty heavy tunes that were clearly more on the metal side. You had Heart's early stuff with, riffs like Barracuda, which, tell me that shit ain't metal. All of this stuff was coming out with, and was getting actual mainstream success at this point. We were, at this point, no longer really in the underground. We were starting to take the main stage. at a lot of rock shows and stuff like that, and on radio stations. Nowhere near to the heights of success that we would get to later in this decade and into the 80s. But this is really when metal started. And obviously, I may do more episodes on this period later on when I have more info or people can come on and share some of their experiences with these bands. All I can really say is I dig every single fucking one of these bands pretty hard. Go listen to them. They are not just great bands, but super influential on everything that came later, not even just certain bands here or there. These guys defined what heavy metal is as a genre. And, there's some even outside their genre, they influenced the mainstream hard rock scene with bands like Motorhead coming into there, who we'll get to in the next couple of episodes because they kind of fit into both categories. And here too, in 1975, 1976, you see a split, a parting of the ways into a new genre of music that was becoming popular in the US and England at the time. And that would be punk. Heavy metal just kind of kept going on and iterating on itself. And punk kind of spun out of this. Like I said, MC5 was a pretty big influence on them. The Stooges, a whole bunch of bands that were really more on the political side of the house and very anti-establishment, very aggressive. And that kind of spun out into, punk, which I've already done a video on the Ramones, who are, the founders of that genre, essentially, just like Sabbath is for metal. And I will hear no argument to the contrary. And unlike the other one that claims to have founded punk, they did more than one record. All right, shit talking kind of over for now. But this is where I think we'll leave it for now, is in 75, 76, because things are about to get very, very interesting on both sides of the house. So I think next time we'll cover the NWO BHM movement, and maybe after that we'll get into punk, because I hate doing them in sequence like that because they are basically contemporaries. Pretty much just picture like an alternate branch here that's running parallel to it, and was constantly cross-pollinating with metal too. I mean, you will see so many punk and metal bands influence each other and be influenced by each other and list each other as, bands that they really like or are listening to. So it makes sense to cover them like this, but at the same time, they are separate genres of music. And we'll start to differentiate a lot more later. Although there will be some very heavy influences on both by each other going forward. And I cannot wait to really get into the NWO BHM movement, because if you think there's a lot of bands in the 60s and throughout the 70s, I barely scratched the surface on bands like this. We're about to get into the Satanic Panic. We're about to get into a lot of bands like Saxon, Priest hitting their prime, Iron Maiden coming on the stage, Motorhead coming out of left field, the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, the Clash. I mean, kind of the end of the classic rock period, and bands like, Led Zeppelin kind of calling it quits towards the end of the decade and all of that. And, there's all of this stuff of new music, especially, to talk about in the late 70s. And that's kind of why I wanted to keep this series going, is there's a lot more of this story to tell than really just, heavy metal sprang out of nowhere and it's been awesome ever since. It has, but there's a lot more detail to it than that, and a lot more things that people either don't know about or wouldn't think about. Obviously, there's bands I've glossed over today that if you guys want me to go into, I'd be happy to go into them on their own separate thing. And if there is a band like that you want to talk about, leave it in the comments below. I check every comment, so I will see it. And, I believe I've done a video on every comment, on every request I've received so far. So with that all being said, keep tuned to this space. Sunday is our normal rock and roll religion, Sunday at 4 p.m. I want to check out the Rumble page. I'm the same name over there. If you want, because Rumble is an area I want to expand into very heavily. Once I'm able to live stream over there reliably, I would probably start doing videos like this, but I can actually play you guys music, which makes this 10 times better. I've been playing around with it in the background on and off for the last couple of months, and it's getting better. I will say it's not perfect yet, but it is improving dramatically. So keep an eye on that. And with that all being said, these videos will be up on my Rumble page about a day after you see them on YouTube. So unfortunately, you guys don't get it at the same time, but once I get the ability to simulcast over there, I will be live streaming on Rumble as well. And we'll do some, less edited stuff over there, or less self-edited stuff over there, both on music and other topics that I feel like talking about. Maybe a lot of pre-recorded stuff. If I have a rant I really want to go on. But with that all being said, hopefully you guys enjoy this. Hopefully you guys stick around for the next couple episodes, because we're about to get, in terms of the musical shift that's about to happen, it is about to hit the fan, and I am here for it. So with that all being said, take care, stay safe. I love you all, and I'll catch you next time.